Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for November 25th, 2022. This is the post-Thanksgiving briefing. I hope people enjoyed themselves yesterday and are prepared to do some real thinking today, because this is an extremely important briefing I'm going to be presenting as part of the Friday question section of the updates. Now, I've received many questions along the lines of what I'm going to be discussing today. So let me tell you, the general topic is, why do you always emphasize the British Empire? What about the role of the United States? Isn't the United States the predominant power in the world? The British Empire died out after World War II. Why is it that you keep focusing on Britain? Well, I'll start by just saying Lyndon LaRouche always emphasized that the United States functions as a dumb giant on a British leash. And we can see that very clearly from what I'll be presenting to you today. But let's start with the reemergence of Boris Johnson, the super British Imperial war hawk, who gave an interview on November 22nd with CNN about his role as Prime Minister and the Ukraine war. Now remember, keep in mind, on April 9th, Johnson did an emergency trip to Kiev when there were reports that Ukraine and Russia had nearly consolidated a negotiation process which would have ended the war. And this was when Zelensky was saying that he would accept the idea that Ukraine will never be in NATO, that they can work out other arrangements, and that he was prepared to reach that agreement. But Johnson went into Kiev and delivered the message from NATO: you must not negotiate, we must continue the war, and we'll give you all sorts of goodies to make sure you stay in the war. And the negotiation ended, and the war has continued with hundreds of thousands of casualties on the Ukrainian side. No one's quite sure how many on the Russian side, but it's increasingly devastating for the people of Ukraine. And what did Johnson deliver? Well, the Brits from the beginning were supplying weapons. They trained tens of thousands of Ukrainian militia, including Azov battalion neo-Nazis, going back to 2014. They trained them in irregular warfare techniques, which is exactly what was applied against the people of the Donbass. And they were also at the center of promoting anti-Russian narratives through their well-known capabilities of hybrid or information warfare. So when Johnson was interviewed on CNN on November 22nd, he opened by attacking Germany and Chancellor Scholz. He said they were not sufficiently committed to the anti-Russian crusade. Germany, he said, believed that Ukraine couldn't win a war, and preferred that it would be better for Ukraine to fold quickly. Now, he said he couldn't support that. He said it was a, quote, disastrous way of looking at the situation, unquote. Now, Johnson served as one of the leaders of the NATO officials who were committed to fighting Russia to the last Ukrainian. In prolonging the war by arming Ukraine and pushing sanctions, by playing on Zelensky's ego to urge him to continue fighting and make him a great superhero, and while playing a role in attacks on Russian infrastructure. Keep in mind that the British are the leading suspects in the Nord Stream pipeline's destruction. You could say that the Ukrainians, given this role of Johnson, that the Ukrainians that are freezing in the dark now are victims of Johnson's gigantic ego. Now, in response to what he said, the German government said, Boris Johnson, quote, always had his own relationship with the truth, unquote. So let's look at Johnson in the context of the British imperial policy over the centuries and the American role. Those Americans who are operating in cooperation today with the British Empire are betraying the tradition of the American Revolution. It was not just a break with Britain, an end to the colonialism imposed on American colonies that was the American Revolution. It was a break with British ideology, with British policy, a policy of free market policy, of free trade, of interference with other nations, of imposing imperial control. And those, today, the reason I say it's a betrayal is those promoting the idea of a rules-based order, whether it's Republicans, whether it's the current administration, they are operating on behalf of the corporate interrelationships between the US and London. These include academic relationships and think tanks, such as the Council on Foreign Relations relationship with its birth mother, the Chatham House, the Atlantic Council, the so-called special relationship, and so on. And this is historically how the British have run their empire. As it was famously said by Lord Palmerston, Britain has no permanent friends, only permanent interests. Now, in saying this, we're not criticizing the English people, but the British system. There have been many important developments in English history. One of the most important is the Tudor Revolution, which overthrew the feudalistic Plantagenet dynasty. The importance of Henry VII in that, and his policy, which was a mercantile policy, which was the beginning of British industrialization. The Republican tradition in the arts, from Marlowe to Shakespeare, Shelley and Keats, extremely important in terms of the development of universal civilization. But at the same time, who were they fighting? Especially clear in Shelley. They were fighting the imperial tradition, which was exported to London from Venice through Amsterdam. The British East India Company, which was modeled on the Dutch East Indies Company. This is who the American Revolution was fought against the ideologues such as John Locke, who put property ahead of happiness in his designation of what a constitution should be. His idea was that you have defense of private property rather than pursuit of happiness, which he put in the North Carolina Constitution. You have Adam Smith, you have Parson Malthus, whose Malthusianism is the subject or is the intent of the Green New Deal today, Jeremy Bentham, and so on. Now, the British system, as it emerged under the East India Company, was based on a colonial policy centered around control of trade and currencies. This is the same today with the Commonwealth. And instead of the British East India Company, you have the City of London. Look at some of the key moments in this. The British role, for example, in the First World War, where British geopolitics, which was a British invention of Halford Mackinder, British geopolitics dictated that Britain must do everything possible to prevent a French-German-Russian alliance from integrating Western Europe with Eurasia. And that continues to be the policy to this very day. The unwillingness to accept the emergence of Asian countries, the potential for Russia as a bridge for Eurasia to Western Europe, which would include Ukraine. That's British geopolitics. That's why we had World War I and World War II, where the British-American trusts, the corporate cartels, put Hitler in, rather than seeing Germany rise in a relationship with Russia and France. At the end of World War II, U.S. intelligence was set up largely through cooperation and direction from the British. Allen Dulles and his networks were very closely integrated with the British. In 1967, with the Pound Crisis, was the beginnings of the breakup of the Bretton Woods system, which was carried forward with the 1971 decision on August 15th by Richard Nixon, under pressure from British operatives such as George Shultz and Paul Volcker and Arthur Burns, to break with Bretton Woods, break with the fixed exchange system, sever the relationship of the reserve standard of the dollar to gold. And that began the descent into the modern bubble economy based on speculative control, the control for the speculators of credit as opposed to investment in physical economy. After that, you had a whole series of wars after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And the leading figures from Britain in this were Margaret Thatcher and Tony Blair. You had the original Iraq War, where Thatcher said she had to stiffen George Herbert Walker Bush's spine to get him to go against Saddam Hussein. You had the role of Blair and MI6 and Richard Dearloffe in presenting their dodgy dossier, which lied about Iraq's weapons of mass destruction, which began the escalation of U.S. attacks into the Middle East. The idea of pushing NATO eastward was an idea that came up with Thatcher and the British command immediately after the collapse of the Soviet Union. The U.S. promised no eastward push, and yet the eastward push became the policy. You had the Balkans War in the latter part of the 1990s. This was not just the U.S., it was NATO. Similarly with Libya, similar to Afghanistan and Iraq and Syria and so on. And at the center of this was MI6. Now, then you look at Russiagate and you see the same networks. The target of Russiagate was Trump and Putin, to say that they were forming an autocratic alliance. And what was the fear? That it would break the so-called special relationship. This was the subject of several major efforts. One was the longer-term effort from the Atlantic Council, which was essentially set up in 1961 to keep the British and Americans allied and on the same page. They began a project called the Democracy Project to define the world in two blocks, the so-called democracies against the authoritarians. This was the subject of a House of Lords report in December 2018, which insisted that British policy must be to ensure that Donald Trump does not win a second term, because as the report says, if Trump wins a second term, the special relationship is dead. And we see then in the whole development of Russiagate, the British hand. And people have forgotten this, mainly because the corruption of people like John Brennan and the Mueller Commission and so on, and Adam Schiff and the Democrats, and Hillary Clinton, of course, you forget that this was initiated by a report from GCHQ, the equivalent of the National Security Agency in Britain, when its leader Hannigan came and met with John Brennan to discuss the fraudulent report that they had evidence Russia was planning cyber attacks on the US elections. And then the Christopher Steele report, remember that? Backed by Sir Richard Dearloffe, then the former head of MI6, but a leading figure in the Atlantic Council. Now, as far as Ukraine, the US was pushed into the forefront with people like Victoria Nuland. Biden was, of course, the Obama overseer of the Ukraine situation. But the talking points were developed by the British. Throughout 2014, at the time of the Maidan coup, before February 2014 and afterwards, Christopher Steele was writing numerous memos from Kiev that were circulated in the State Department by Nuland to John Kerry's State Department officials to shape U.S. policy. So this is a very clear situation. Then you add to that what I reported earlier on Boris Johnson's role. Now, here's a very interesting side note. Remember Nina Jankowicz, the unhinged, self-proclaimed Mary Poppins of disinformation, who was appointed briefly to head the Disinformation Governance Board in the Department of Homeland Security. She was supposed to lead it, but she was such a bizarre figure, and it was so clear that she was committed to censorship that there was opposition enough that she had to step down. Part of the opposition was based on the fact that she had been a promoter of the attempts to suppress the Hunter Biden laptop story to proclaim it was Russian disinformation. But there's a whole background to her that most people don't know. She worked closely as part of what was called the UK cluster of something called the Integrity Initiative, which was a long-term British operation aimed at promoting censorship and putting out real disinformation. That was funded by the British government as a part of media public relations policies. And this was exposed very much, but the Integrity Initiative had to disappear, but it still exists in various agencies, including those that control the BBC. She was sent to Ukraine, where she worked very closely with a group called Stop Fake, which was, as far as we can tell, the original fact-checking agency, which was run by neo-Nazis. And their Stop Fake stories were designed to cover up the role of neo-Nazis in the Ukrainian so-called revolution, namely the US-sponsored coup, but also to say that all these stories are the result of Russian disinformation. She was a collaborator of them in Kiev in 2017. Now, here's the kicker. This week, she filed with the U.S. Justice Department as a, quote, foreign agent, unquote, working for the Center for Information Resilience, which is a British operation in promoting disinformation under the guise of fighting disinformation. So after being kicked out as the disinformation czar in the United States, she's now returning, working directly with the British to impose censorship on the United States, especially regarding Russia and the Ukraine war. So there's much more that could be said about this British question, but I hope that this gives you some insights into the toxic idea behind the US-UK special relationship. Makes it clear we're not talking about the English people, but we are talking about an imperial decision to use geopolitics to divide the world into competing blocs and to make sure that the talking points that get out in the United States, whether it's in media, academic circles, think tanks, the Congress, that the ideas are shaped around this conception of the special relationship in which the United States functions, as Lyndon LaRouche said, as a dumb giant on a British leash. And today, that dumb giant is designed or is committed to imposing a new world economic order based on the supremacy of London and Wall Street and the suppression of sovereign interests of other nations around the world. So that's my report for today. See you again next week.